right, thanks everybody for joining us for this month's edition of African Liberty webinar. My name, as usual, is Ibrahim Babatunde Anoba, Editor-in-Chief of African Liberty, and it's good to be back after a couple of months away. I am so pleased to have among us two brilliant powerhouses in the African public policy political space. Dr. Geci Karuri-Sebina, please correct me if I do not pronounce your name correctly. And Professor Sebina is a scholar-practitioner focused on the intersection of people, place, time, and technological change, with particular interest in Global South. She is an associate professor in digital governance at Wits University in Johannesburg, an adjunct professor at the University of Cape Town's African Center for Cities, and a principal at the School of International Futures. Dr. Geci also serves as the organizer of the Civic Tech Innovation Network. She holds a dual bachelor's degree in computer science and sociology, dual master's degree in architecture and urban planning, and a PhD in planning and innovation studies from the University of Witwatersrand. Welcome, Dr. Sebina.
Thank you very much.
Great. Also, we have our Kags, who is the Executive Director of the Open Institute, an organization dedicated to fostering open governance, citizen engagement, and data rights across sub-Saharan Africa. Recently, our CAG is recognized as an Ashoka Fellow for his pioneering contributions to social innovation. Our CAG is a steadfast advocate for transparency in government and data rights across Africa. He chairs on the board of Publish What You Fund and was previously a member of the Technological Advisory Committee of the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. His leadership extends through numerous key roles, including as a former member of the Global Open Data Working Group, co-chair of the Kenya OGP Working Group, and chair of the Kenya Open Data Taskforce. Welcome, Kags.
Thank you very much.
Awesome. So just to dive straight into it, I would like to have both of your opinions on how we got here. Particularly, I'm talking about this recent wave of protest, not only in Kenya and Nigeria, but as we've seen from the start of the year, this so-called youth-led protests that seem to have engulfed the continent in 2024. How did we get to this point, Professor Sabina? In 1 or 2 minutes, then I go to our Kags.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim, for this question. And actually, I am just as excited as you to hear from Kags. The reason being that I am based in South Africa. I'm Kenyan born, which you in your audience may not know. And it's interesting because we had an election this year in South Africa. There was a lot of concern about whether it would have led to unrest for various political reasons, but also social reasons. South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world. And I would say the situation is actually untenable in the form that it is. And I think this is one of the issues, and I'm curious to hear if we talk about Nigeria or Kenya, to what extent we look at data like inequality data that itself tells, I think, an important story that is actually self-evident in many of the places where we live as being one of the issues. Now, I guess we would say we were lucky that we didn't end up collapsing into the kind of unrest we have seen elsewhere. But I think this, what we're seeing as an incident is actually something that's constantly bubbling under in many of our countries. And I would attribute a lot of it to the levels of inequality, of dissatisfaction. I was in a session yesterday that Budget hosted in Nigeria, and they asked a question to the audience of largely young people. The question was, how many of you feel your vote counts? And hardly anybody raised their hand. And we were talking about people's trust in electoral processes and digital options, but I think to some extent the issue is more complex even than that. We've known for a long time that people protest because, yes, there may be some corruption happening at a ballot stand, but I think the even bigger issue of dissatisfaction is when people lose faith in whether it even matters whether they vote or not, because whoever is going to be there is not going to change their life. If we believe that a democratic system and a functioning democracy is about delivering well-being to people, delivering hope to people, we are in a continent where I think for very, very many young people, that doesn't appear to be the outcome of that kind of participation. So it's not just, do you think your vote is being stolen? The question of whether your vote means anything for you begins to take much deeper meaning. So I think I'll stop there just to say that we feel in South Africa that we averted protest, which we saw in other parts of the continent, but I believe it's simply bubbling under, waiting for the next incident, because we continue to have these levels of disenfranchisement, inequality, and dissatisfaction with the quality of governance that we have. Thank you.
All right, so mainly level of inequality and disenfranchisement. Okay. Kags, do you think otherwise?
So I don't, but I think I want to add this, that for me, when I look at the protests, especially in Kenya, I have a certain sense of pride because I feel like it is in one part, the result of the last, I want to say 12 years of my life. When I saw the protests, these protests were different, especially from the first one and the second one, even before they became very violent. They were very different. They were almost festive. They were almost, in fact, my friend of mine, Wamboi JL, was observing that they were almost like people had come out to a street party of sorts. Everybody was in a themed color. They had their phone, they had their water bottle, and they were armed with a lot of data. They had read the budgets. They had read the finance bill. They had read all the other bills that were supposed to be around it. They had read tax law. They had set up ChatGPT, those custom GPTs. They had set up those custom GPTs to analyze the budgets, to analyze all of these things and to explain them. They had set up TikTok channels where they were actually doing explainers. People who are normally dancing were taking a break from the dancing to do explainers, what this budget means, what this tax law means, what this means to different people. We were seeing a very, in fact, I would encourage anyone to just go on TikTok, on Instagram, on Twitter and see and just search reject finance bill and just look at the Kenyan posts around that. It's fascinating for me. I've been going back and looking at them and thinking it's remarkable how much work we have done trying to get government to be transparent, and now that transparency is leading to a very awakened people. I want to tell you what's happening now. People are not protesting on the streets. But every day at midnight in the club, when people are dancing, they take a break from dancing to chant that our president must go. That there is a song that comes, it's called Anguka Nayo, which means directly translated as fall with it or something. But basically saying, where the people are now taking the time to express their dissatisfaction, their anger, their approval ratings, whatever you will call it, in the club when they're having their drinks. So they stop, they pause for a few minutes, and they're chanting, Ruto must go, Ruto must go, and then they continue with their merrymaking. Without prejudice to whether or not you want Ruto to go or not. The fact, for me, that expression, the fact that people are actually taking the time to express is an important one. The other thing that we are noticing is in church functions, when politicians are taking the mic and they start speaking in a way that people feel is divisive, people start singing over them. Because the now impeached deputy president told his people that, well, if you feel, just calm down, but if you feel angry, break into song. And so what people have been doing is that, so Kags takes the mic and he starts saying, I am saying this guy and that guy, and somebody just starts singing. And suddenly the whole church is singing and I'm drowned out. So it doesn't matter. I keep, we saw one of the president's advisors be drowned out. We even saw the current deputy president being drowned out at a funeral because people didn't want to hear what he has to say. this level of expression is coming out of a situation where we are now seeing people reading bills, which they never, in my generation, people never read bills when they are in their 20s, but now they are. So I think we've come to a place where the availability of data, the availability of information is one driver. Another major driver is just the generation. That is true for Kenya, it is true for Nigeria, it is true for South Africa, it is true for wherever you go. We have a much more enlightened, aware, inspired, outspoken generation. They know what it is that they want, and they feel that they can grab it. This generation and its characteristics, in my view, are not new. In Kenya, as well in most countries of Africa, I don't know if you know that majority of the first presidents of Africa were in their 20s. Most of them were in they were Gen Zs of that time. I think we've just come full circle to a place where now 20-year-olds are now saying, we're here and we are here to stay.
Yeah. So one thing I'm grabbing from your points, and what I've seen as well, is that there seems to be a new culture of protest, a new culture of political engagement and awareness from this so-called Gen Z. And I guess one of the main, if not the main criticism of this new culture is about its effectiveness and sustenance. People have said, well, the people making these policy changes, these policy conversations are not happening on Twitter Spaces. The lawmakers are not even active on Twitter. They're not even going to church all the time. They're not even going to the clubs, that they are still in the parliament buildings and in the secretariat to discuss. And if people keep, advocating or protesting in this unconventional way, in these unconventional spaces, then that brings to question the effectiveness of it. That do we still need to engage policy conversations in the orthodox way, or do we stick to this new Gen Z way of protesting in terms of effectiveness, just to say? So, Dr. Sebina, do you want to chime in on that? Then we go to Kags.
Well, when you don't have a seat at the table from which to participate more formally, then I would say any means you can devise are highly effective. And I think what we saw in Kenya this year, I think maybe unprecedented, at least in visibility, if not in scale and not in passion and effort, because again, I think probably boosted by media. I don't think I met anybody in South Africa on my travels who didn't ask me, wow, what's happening in Kenya? I mean, everybody knew something was happening in Kenya. So for sure, those decision makers knew something was happening in Kenya. And individually or even in an organized lobby, those young people could not have gotten that kind of attention. And so I think that effectiveness, I'm not sure that I would say it's ineffective. I think these days, media and media image and political pressure, including perhaps on some of the international institutions that would want to be seen on the right side of things, I think would have felt the pressure of what the young people in Kenya did. I think sustainability is a different question, and that I might like to hear from Al how he feels about that. I've spoken to a few people about it. Obviously, often what we've seen in many movements like this is that I think a combination of intervention, obviously, from the keepers of the systems, but also, I guess, just the fuel to keep going. At some point, we tend to see them wane. Sometimes after having made some progress, sometimes not. I think it'll be interesting to hear whether I think it's nice to hear that there are these ripples that are still there in Kenya. I don't know at scale whether we still feel that sort of there's something sustainable here. But I would also question whether sometimes these moments are about sustainability, because I think people also grow up. So I like Al's point that this is not the first time. We have, there's always the young Turk generation. There's always the next, some more visible, some more impactful than others. But at some point, I do feel strongly that people get on with their lives and other people have to carry on, because otherwise we would be sacrificing a whole generation of people to spend their lives doing this, where at some point people need, I think, also to be able to get on with their own personal lives. So the collective is important, the movement is important, but people need to eat, people need to rest, people need to also have a life.
Right. So before our CAG responds, I want to remind our audience to please drop your question in the Q&A box, and I'll be sure to bring them up. But to add to Dr. Sebina's point, I was wondering if you could. I mean, a lot of people have said young people are often easily distracted. So they coming out in protest of maintaining this voice in the clubs or churches is not so-called sustainable. They're gonna be distracted by the next wave of Grammy controversies or Afrobeats album battle. But do you think that's a reason why we need to still do things the orthodox way, the so-called lobbying way? Because the lobbyists are always going to be in the parliament. Or do you agree with Professor Sabina when she says she doesn't sense that fear of this is going to go away anytime soon? Or what do you think?
I don't think it's going away anytime soon. I don't think that it's ineffective. In fact, I think it's remarkably effective. One of the biggest challenges when you're talking about political awareness, or when you're talking about political sustaining political views, is when citizens themselves are talking to each other about whatever political perspectives they want to push forward. Now, the Gen Zs are using their platform, which is Instagram, which is all of this media, to basically keep pushing certain discussions and certain questions. So I'm now constantly seeing them taking different forms. On Twitter, there's a guy who made a cartoon with the president's shape head here in Kenya, and that has just become completely viral. They have tried to figure out who it is that is doing this. They cannot figure out who this person is, but he's doing some remarkable cartoons that are bringing out some aspects of either what the president said and he has not done, or whatever it is. Number two is the number of young people that have copied Morara Kebaso. Morara Kebaso is a Kenyan political young figure who has been going and basically taking the president's campaign promises, going to where those campaign promises are and saying, here it is. Now, one of the big things that our president did that kind of shot him in the foot was that he actually made very specific promises. He said, by this time, I will put this thing here. So people would go after that time and say, well, he said that time, it has passed. I'm here and this thing is not here. So that's become very common now, and young people are actually doing it. Another thing that we're seeing is, and this is all happening on the social media, it's all happening in conversations, it's happening in houses, it's happening in dates. In Kenya, you just need to say to a taxi driver something like, hey, this country, yeah? And for the rest of the ride, you will hear about it. Like there will be a full, and I've tested it. Every time I've taken a taxi, I've said, hey, this country, yeah? And from that point, I was told what is happening in this country and what their perspectives are. And people are so specific. They're saying, Kags said that he would eradicate all the green in the trees. Now we are seeing that he's now taking a different position and he's actually adding green in the trees. And where he's getting his information is that he's following some guy on TikTok who is giving him information. And that is sort of progressing in that respect. I don't think that it's going to stop. And I think that it's going to be a lot more effective than the traditional lobbying for this reason. The traditional lobbying could be compromised. The traditional lobbying could compromise. People's narratives don't. I expected a stadium at this place. If the stadium is not there, I am going to keep asking you I'm going to keep reminding you what you said. You said that you're going to put a stadium here. You said that we are going to lower our taxes. Our taxes are higher. You are saying, I saw a young person just yesterday, actually, on TikTok say, President's State of the Union says that we are at our best economic time in a long time. Inflation is down to 2.2%. Great, that's verifiable, it's true. Our GDP has grown by 5%. Great. And then he moved on from there. What he didn't say is, I can count 10 companies that have fired more than 400 people in the last couple of months. So people are asking the question, so fine, inflation is down, cost of living, cost of buying maize flour is down, but at the same time, there's a problem that I cannot afford. Even when it is cheaper, I can't afford this thing because I've been fired. I don't have a job anymore. So explain that. People are actually following up with those narratives. Now, MPs are having a hard time going home, because they are going home and meeting people who are saying, guys, you're supporting that guy and we're not, and their promises that stories are not adding up. And that is now putting pressure on them. That pressure is a lot more effective than any traditional lobbying could have ever achieved.
Okay, so my biggest concern, and a lot of people have experienced this concern, and I'm sure you've seen it too, is the power that many of these governments have in shutting down or meddling with this so-called canvassing media. We saw it in Nigeria and Uganda, where the government pretty much threatened or actually shut down social media space. During election in Mozambique, Mauritius, Sudan, the government in those countries also shut down social media for a while. So if people are actually organizing, and organizing is the core of any protest movements. If the governments have the power to shut down social media at just a one-thumb stroke of the pen, doesn't again that threaten this new vibe of new way of organizing and give credence to the traditional way of protest? What do you think, Dr. Sebina?
Often it's always interesting to me how much the digital mirrors actually what we simply used to do in other ways. The issue of shutting down or slowing down people's access, it was a club and a boot. Now it's shutting down or slowing down the internet. I mean, obviously, we're shutting down the internet. The scale of it can be quite sudden and quite vast. But is it any different really in effect? So the idea that if people want to prevent your access, that they can do so, and they can do so through violence is what we've known. It's kind of how this works. And so I think, yes, of course, it frustrates the actions. Can they do that permanently? No. And I think even in countries that do it routinely, it's on and off, or it's slow for a while. At some point, you have, and until they get smart enough to figure out how to shut off, certain people and not others, they're sort of forced to come back online. So I think the issue of that kind of oppressive response is something that I worry about. And in fact, if I can load onto your question, I'm curious for Kenya, besides, yes, the slowing down of the internet or the shutting it off occasionally, what else we imagine maybe the kinds of responses and maybe even more far-reaching responses or reactions we might begin to see to these protests? Because my belief is that these big systems don't do nothing, and they've learned something from what happened. Al led by saying, for example, that perhaps our successes with creating access to data and information may have been a good thing in terms of helping inform people, but do we anticipate a reaction or a response to that? So do we begin to see not just the internet being shut down, but perhaps access to certain kinds of information being made more difficult? Do we see or imagine any other, or are we beginning to see any other responses that are really about shutting down the space?
Right. Okay. So I want you to help us take this question, then maybe respond to the response by Professor Sebina. So there's an anonymous attendee who is asking, my question focuses on the role of youth in governance, considering that Africa has one of the youngest populations in the world, yet youth participation in decision-making remains limited. The question is, how can we encourage more youth involvement in governance and decision-making process to create long-term solutions for better governance? Emphasis on involvement in governance and decision-making process.
So here, number one, I think there's a problem with us purporting to claim that we are going to involve the youth in governance and decision-making processes. I think there's a bit of a misnomer there. Just like I think there's a bit of a misnomer lately. I was educated by some young people who told me, listen, we're 70% of the population. We are not protesting on behalf of the youth. We are protesting on behalf of Kenyans because we are Kenyans. We are the majority. It's not you old fogies who are the majority. What they're basically saying is this, as I have come to understand it. To a certain extent, we old fogies, I've got a little bit of gray hair, so you know that I'm a bit of an old fogey. We old fogies have to get out of the way in some respect and just allow them to engage, because they will engage. We just need to make sure that they have the necessary information, and then we leave them alone. Because the truth of the matter is, you switch off the internet is now like electricity. It is like water. You can only switch it off for a couple of days maximum. It's not enough time for you to demobilize a movement. What you might do is that you might demobilize a day. You might cancel an event because of the fact that we were not able to organize ourselves. But I want you to know something. In Kenya, they actually did try to do that during the protests that we had in June. What they did is that they went to where the people were in the city center, and they fiddled with the Safaricom network so that people couldn't make calls and send SMSs. So calls were bouncing and stuff like that. These kids went and got smart. They went and bought Starlink. They went and bought Starlink dishes, put them all over the street. And then they downloaded an app that I think is called Zello, if I'm not wrong, which is like a walkie-talkie app. And they moved to organize on that walkie-talkie app entirely outside of the existing network. This is stuff that was happening. Now, when people are able to do that, they literally they have the agency to go and find the money to buy those Starlink dishes. They have the agency to set, and the knowledge and the technical know-how to set them up and make sure that the street is fully covered with Wi-Fi. They have the ability to find this app that is operating outside of all telephony. You want to tell me that you can control these people? You want to tell me that you can switch off something and it phases these people? You can't. They figured out how to operate VPNs in ways that even the intelligence unit had to run to catch up to understand. The fact of the matter is, in my view, and I'm a little presumptive in speaking for the continent here, but I think I am right in saying that the train has left the station regardless of which African country you're speaking to. Even in Uganda, even in Mozambique, we've seen what's happening in Mozambique lately. I've seen some really gory videos, but guess what? The train has left the station. I was watching videos and you can on YouTube about Mozambique and Madagascar and the level of underdevelopment that some of these countries have. And we would think that because of the fact that people don't have the kind of internet access that Kenyans have, then they are controlled. Unfortunately, that's not true. Even with the smallest, most expensive internet, people are doing some really interesting things. In Malawi, we are seeing people who are going into people who have internet, who have access to internet, downloading stuff and going into communities and sharing it with them. We are seeing people actually speaking out. The level of influencing that is happening in countries where the internet is not 100% accessible like the way it is accessible in Kenya, there is influencing that is still happening. And that influence it has left the station. There's nothing anybody can do about it, to be honest.
Right. Okay, so Professor Sebina, there's a question here from Joseph Njoka about the role of the traditional media outlets. One of the things we observed during this last wave of protests in both Kenya and Nigeria is how the social media was focusing on the activities of the young people mobilization, where the traditional media was talking about the chaos of it. in fact, giving platform for government officials to actually express their dissatisfaction and not necessarily featuring, to a large extent, the voice of young people. So do you anticipate this kind of modality of operation by the traditional media to continue, or do you think at some point they will like make the way for the new generation of media outlets? Or what is your general assessment of the role of the media houses?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm probably speaking a little bit beyond my station. I'm not primarily invested in the media industry, but we in South Africa have hosted now for a while the Journalism and Media Innovation Festival alongside our Civic Tech Festival. So I do get to listen to them sometimes. And I think big traditional media appears to be in a form of its own crisis. A little bit like the dinosaurs went through a bit of a crisis, I'm sure, before they disappeared completely. And I'm not saying that they will disappear, but I do think that there are elements of some traditional media houses obviously being agents and financed by the system, which puts them in a particular position. And I think we see that most obviously, within certain countries, for those who know who's who. I mean, we see it very visibly in the US, the politics of, CNBC, Fox, whomever, and you begin to see clearly, where people's bread is buttered, and that's reflected then in what they choose to project. So the idea that media is an objective and equal and fair voice for all is really generally not the case. And that's the difference, obviously, with new social media, which can be far more diffuse, and there's a higher degree of agency in terms of who chooses to share what. And it's not as vested, if you want, in the political economy of the media industry. But having said that, and to be fair, I have seen, I think both in South Africa and to some extent in Kenya, I'm not sure how it went in Nigeria, but where even some of those traditional ones did cover some of the content. Now, whether they did that for profit or because they're down with it, I'm not sure. But a lot of what I saw, in fact, was also on traditional media, and I thought that was interesting. Maybe that's the market, maybe people realize that you can't be completely outside of what's going on. If there's a moment and you're not covering the moment, then you're probably not being effective. And I've also heard many people who are in traditional media as individuals, if not as institutions, who are very committed to the task of good journalism. And I think we saw some of that. But by and large, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the bulk of what was out there, of course, was young people speaking directly. And perhaps that's the future. Perhaps that's how, in a post-truth world, in a world where there's a lot of control and curation of the content we receive, perhaps being able to get it directly is one of the responses, I suppose, to the trust we may lose in traditional media.
Yeah. Thanks, Prof. So, one of the root causes of this last protest in Kenya is President Ruto's attempt to use tax revenues to pay back the $80 billion owed to China. And a lot of people who are critical of the protest have said, well, these young people did not really turn out in this way when Kenya was borrowing the money. And why was that quietness? And why is it that now, when the consequences about taxation increase, that people are actually coming out? So is it the case that young people are not really interested in the more silent but consequential issues like heavy government borrowing, and they are only pretty much interested in more popular policy issues like taxes? Do you think the argument of people not being aware of, the breadth of policy discussion is a problem here, or do you have some other thought about it?
I think that's wrong. I think it's a bad way of looking at it, and it's a bad argument. And I'm not one to normally criticize arguments, but that's a bad argument, and I'll say why it's a bad argument. Number one, most people don't know when government is borrowing. A lot of the deals are made behind the cloak of secrecy, under the Secrecy Act, and that happens in most countries. When it is most countries do not have their bilateral discussions with China, with the US, with Europe, being public information. But the finance bill is something that directly involves Kenyans, and the finance bill states how much debt we owe. So I give you an example. I was being educated about we have a wonderful project called the SGR, which is a train that comes from Nairobi to Mombasa, or to Mombasa to Nairobi. I'm not sure where it starts from, but you can go both ways. And it's supposed to be this ultra modern. It was sold to Kenyans as very ultra modern, blah 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 blah. And it costs 750 billion shillings. I don't know what that translates to in USD for everybody else, but Google is there. Now, the challenge that now exists is this. When that deal was being made, it was secret. Nobody ever saw the contract. Even up to now, people have been chasing to find that contract. Nobody saw that contract. Nobody knew when the deal was done. The only thing they saw is, we have agreed with China and they have come to build our railway. And that's going on. Later, politicians who are in the know come out and tell people that, guys, by the way, we paid 3 times more the value of that train, and only this amount of money went into it, and it was a bad deal. The only reason why Kenyans have been able to stop the takeover of our airport by a private Indian company called Adani, is because the young people are very aware of this. And in fact, what happened was, somebody, I think, who works within government leaked the documents relating to that public-private procurement process. They leaked the document to an influencer that they follow. And that influencer made it public. And luckily, he doesn't live in Kenya, he lives in another country. Made it public and pushed it through Twitter, so that it became the big story that it had become. And people then started to look for information about this Adani person. People started looking for information about, who is this person that we are making a deal with? What is this deal that we seem to be making? People went and read those documents. They created ChatGPT GPTs to explain those very legal documents to the simplest person. Then they went and created the videos. And as we speak today, the president at his latest state of the office in Parliament cancelled that contract. Why did he cancel it? Because he didn't want it. It's just simply because of the fact that it had become so unpopular. And finally, the US went and indicted the fellow of some corruption wrongdoing. And as a result of that, he now had to bend to the will of these young people who are saying, we are not going to have Adani take over the airport. Right. I don't think it's true to say that young people don't know, don't care when the deals are being made, because sometimes those deals are being made behind closed doors.
Yeah.
But they're there.
Yeah. Okay. On the point about the leak, Professor Sebina, do you think this is a problem? Because part of the criticism that both the Kenyan and Nigerian governments levied against the protest was that these have been funded by opposition parties. They're being funded by some disgruntled elements in the government that wants to destabilize the government and the country. To a large extent, that could be true, because as we've seen in Nigeria, the protest was actually powered by someone who actually contested and lost the presidency in the last election. I don't know if that's the case in Kenya, but what do you think about this general attitude of criticizing protests based on opposition involvement?
So I'm going to speak not off of fact. I think we should hear from Kenya what it is that actually happened there. But I do think there are two sides of this that may be worth paying some attention to. It wouldn't be the first time that, in fact, we see exactly that where you've got nasty politics, that there are, a sort of inappropriate and very dangerous sometimes approaches to funding. I think in Kenya they call them hooligans, but to funding actions that appear to be civic actions, but in fact are something else, or funding civic actions that escalate into extremely violent and long-standing conflicts. And we've seen these around the world. So I wouldn't want to ignore that has happened, and that probably does happen in some cases. However, to say that that is what happens in all cases and to reduce any civil action, which I've seen them try to do in South Africa sometimes, sometimes in South Africa, even though we're so used to civic actions here, we can't possibly ascribe them all to that. But I do think there is sometimes this belief or this desire to sell that narrative that any civic action is simply some disgruntled politician funding, people to take to the streets. And I don't think civil society can be reduced to just that. And I think to reduce people's right to civic action to the suspicion that it must be something else, I think is something we should be careful about assuming in all cases. So I don't want to deny that it's happened and in dangerous ways, but I think it would not be fair to say that that is always the case. Anytime people take to the streets, it's somebody financing it. Obviously, things take finance, but people are quite capable of financing themselves as they do in many instances, even in my context.
Right. So,
yeah,
go ahead. Yeah, just play out quickly.
In Kenya, they said that the Gen Z protests were funded first by Russia, then by I don't know who, then by Ford Foundation and us and others. I feel very strongly about this, that even though there may be financing in some places, you will actually notice what is financed and what is not. What is orchestrated tends to become violent. It tends to become destructive. It tends to become very obvious that it has been cooked in one way or another.
Mm.
When you look at when protests are literally just bubbling up, like in the case of Kenya, like in the case of what you're seeing in Mozambique, when things are just bubbled up, you can clearly see if somebody is willing to die for what they believe in. And no amount of money can organize that. You can't. It is very difficult for you to organize millions of people to get onto the streets, because even the richest of the politicians don't have the kind of money that they portend that they can afford to do that. So it's, yes, the funding happens, but it happens at a smaller scale. It's just that the level of chaos is higher.
Mm.
But the one that really is true is a larger scale, and at a number one, and number two, it is, you can see the spirit inside it. You can tell.
Okay, so my question to you, Professor Geci, is how this idea that there could be some foreign meddling, and I don't really blame any governments that came out, particularly, let's take Nigeria for example, that said this had some Russian handwriting in it, because we live in a region where countries were being engulfed by coups to a large extent, triggered by the Wagner Group and, of course, an extension of Russia. And during the protests in Nigeria, a lot of people were arrested waving Russian flags. So there is that concern there. But what do you say to young people who are leading these protests regarding how they should navigate this terrain while conscious of the potential of foreign meddling?
So one of the things I've really liked about some of the protests that I've tracked often is their radical transparency, because what that means is that in a way you hold yourself to the same standard you're trying to hold those you're protesting against, which is to say that you're not part of then covert deals with whomever, and now we don't know quite who's financing and what you're representing. I think people can be very upfront about what it is they're doing and how it is that they're doing it. And they're even posting it themselves. So there's no secret there. You don't have to do the investigative journalism to find out where the money is coming from. I think obviously an awareness of geopolitics and that, but I could be wrong about this, but I suspect with young people, we've heard about financing that's coming to the contest, not even just about the Russians and the Chinese, which is what people always talk about, but what about the, right-wing North that has been funding these cultural ideas about what traditional African ways are, and in a way trying to counter the LGBTQ movements. And there's actual funding, there's research that's being done by the legal fraternity to show us that there's funding coming in that's supporting. Now, that is a narrative movement, I would say, that is funded externally, and I do think it's quite dangerous and is counter-civic. But we sometimes exaggerate, I think, some of these other narratives, but being aware of them is important because I think it can compromise movements in important ways. I think transparency is very important. I think educating ourselves is very important. In our context, at least in South Africa, however, where we've seen the biggest examples of such, it hasn't been to young youthful movements, actually. It's been to the bigger structures, and that's been a lot more, I think, clandestine and a lot more impactful. But I think for young people, that's what I would just warn is be aware of the world you are in. You can be trying to do things innocently and well, but just be careful your bedfellows. But if I'm honest, in my context, I haven't really seen very much of that.
Thanks, Prof. My final question to you. You work on data rights, and maybe I'm thinking about this question because I live in the US. The way governments have got closer to these social media companies to get people's data to use it to surveil and monitor some stubborn heads that are leading protests. Do you think this could be the case in Africa? Because I'm thinking about when Nigeria threatened last year to ban Twitter. Is it last year or maybe a couple of years ago? And Twitter, this was before Elon Musk took over. And eventually they kowtowed to the Nigerian government and, did what they wanted. This was a big problem to many Nigerians using Twitter to mobilize. Do you think we should be aware, or how should we be aware about how the so-called data companies, Telegram and WhatsApp, could potentially be collaborating with the government to surveil and monitor these protests?
I think it's just eternal vigilance. The fact of the matter is, I do think that it happens to a certain extent, where countries are, where citizens are a lot more vigilant.